So early in my career as a working photographer, I was hired to photograph a wedding. In fact, it was my first and last wedding that I ever shot for several reasons. And while I came away from that experience learning a lot about myself, there's one lesson in particular that has stuck with me all these years. So shortly before delivering my first round of edited selects to my wedding clients, I shared them with a trusted friend who's also a skilled wedding photographer for his critique. After a few hours, he came back to me and he said, "Brian, these photos look like they were edited by 10 different people." Now, there are many lessons to learn from that straightforward assessment, but the one that I keep going back to is the value and importance of developing a consistent editing workflow. It's okay if you go to the same sliders and tools over and over, even if it results in your images having that consistent look, so long as you're doing it with intent. And that's what I want to show you in this editing video. If you've watched my videos before, you'll probably be familiar with these techniques. But that's totally okay because at the end, I know I'll produce a photo that fits with my overall style and that I'd be really excited to share. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so here we are in Lightroom Desktop as usual, and this is the photo we're going to work on. So really quickly, just to look at the details of it, this was taken with a Sony a7R Mark IV and the Sony 24-70 f2.8 GM. So I took this a few years ago. This was taken in northern Idaho along Beauty Creek. I love this part of the state. And so the purpose here is pretty straightforward. Depending on the type of photo that I'm editing, I generally have a workflow. I go through the same motions. That's not to say that the same tools are used for all of my photos. This is obviously a landscape photo. If it were a bird photo, I'd probably be doing something different. It would be the same for the most part for my bird photos. But when it comes to, say, for example, a landscape photo, I will be using a certain set of tools in a certain order, and I generally will do that over and over for all of my landscape photos. And that's what I want to convey here. So again, let's go here. We'll go to the edit stack. Now, generally speaking, the first thing that I like to do is get kind of my composition dialed in. And to start, usually that means going all the way down the edit stack under optics and enabling lens correction. So you can see here, I'm going to turn on, and if I toggle the mute, you can see that it actually does a good job of fixing a little bit of that distortion from the 24-70 millimeter lens. Next, I'll go ahead and I'm going to see, do I need to crop this photo? Do I need to fix any of the geometry? And so really quickly, I'm looking and I'll generally scan the outer edges of the frame to see if overall I need to crop in. Now, I could crop in just because this little bit of this white cap over here is bothering me, but there's no sense. I can just fix this with a generative remove stroke, which I'll do in a minute. But I do know that I want to fix geometry. I'm seeing this tree here. It doesn't look perfectly straight. Now, if you missed my last video, don't worry, I'll link to it at the end of this one. But I talk about the importance of geometry because it's something that I think a lot of people, myself especially included, often overlook. So if I go to the crop panel over here, you'll see there's this section called geometry, and under that is transform. And specifically what I want to do is go to this vertical slider. And so watch, if I adjust the vertical slider, you can see if I go to the right, the tree looks like it starts to bend backwards. I actually want to go the opposite direction until the tree really looks properly straight, like this. Now, because making that adjustment comes at the expense of this composition here, I'm going to go ahead and click on this constrain crop checkbox, which will automatically crop the image in until only valid pixels are visible. And what I also might do is rotate this clockwise just a tiny bit. All right, so that's generally the first thing I do. So I'm working on just tightening up the composition. The next thing that I do is I look to see if there are any distractions that I can remove using the generative remove brush, and there are. Like, normally I don't mind these kinds of branches, but when there are some that are especially bright that kind of draw my eye, and it's not something I want to draw my viewer's eye to, that's something that needs to be removed. So this here, these kind of branches over here that are catching the light. And like I said, this little bit of this white cap over here that's at the edge of the frame, it just bothers me. Also, this little branch here that's sticking out, I want to get rid of that. So to do that, let's go to remove. I want to make sure that the use generative AI checkbox is enabled, and that's going to use Firefly to remove this instead of the older content aware heal method. So let's go ahead here. I'm going to adjust my brush size accordingly, and I'm just going to start making various strokes. And I'm going to make all my strokes in one shot here. So just getting rid of this. And you can see I'm not like super particular about it. I'm going to get rid of this over here, and this there. Then let's get rid of that over there, and then this bit over here. And then also, since I'm just nitpicking, just these areas here that are breaking up the really pretty moss. So that. Also up here, these branches, they've got to go. They bother me. With that done, we've got our selections made. All I need to do is click on Remove to get rid of them using Firefly. And so taking a quick kind of visual inspection around the frame, everything looks good. What I'll do now is there are a few tiny little things that I want to fix. I don't need to use Firefly for this. So I'm going to turn Use Generative AI off. So like this little spot right here, I'm going to get rid of, and then right here, I'm going to get rid of that spot there. All right, now that we have kind of dialed in the composition and gotten rid of the distracting elements, we can actually start editing the photo. And so my editing workflow generally is kind of like a 1, 2, 3 punch. So I start off by making global edits. So fixing the tone and color of the photo, not much more beyond that. Then I'm going to start making localized edits using masking. And then I return back to the global edit stack to make the fine tune edits like sharpening, a lens blur if it needs it. So those kinds of things. So to start, like I mentioned, let's start with fixing color and tone. The way I usually start is I compare. First, I'm going to click on auto. So I compare auto, which you can see here. It actually makes adjustments to these sliders under light and color. Or I can click it again to undo it and compare that to the adaptive color profile. And so I actually prefer adaptive color here for one really important reason, and that is this amount slider. Because with this amount slider, what I can do is I can dial this back. So unlike the auto button, which makes adjustments to these sliders, I can control the overall strength here. And so like right around here looks good for me. In fact, I might dial it up just a bit more. All right, now what I'm going to do is adjust some of these sliders here. Like I'm going to push the blacks up a bit. I'm going to open the shadows up a bit, and I'm going to open up the exposure just a bit here. Now you might be wondering like, well, you know, I'm seeing the highlights here in the water and they're getting a bit hot. And you might say, all right, cool, let's just adjust the highlights globally. But I actually recommend not doing that because really the highlights that need to be adjusted are only here in the water. And again, knowing what I know about the tools at my disposal, I know that I can create a landscape mask that will target the water so I can make a localized adjustment to the highlights. So only the highlights here will be affected and I don't have to worry about the highlights throughout the rest of the image. Or I can make a separate adjustment to the highlights with a different mask for the rest of the image. Now you'll notice how I did not apply any contrast using the contrast slider. That's because I never do that. I like to control contrast using a point curve, using a very basic S curve. So I'm going to drop a point here, drag it down, which will kind of deepen the shadows. So like this looks good. Drop a point here to boost the highlights. And then point in the middle for midtones, so right around there. Then let's go ahead, as usual, taking the black point here and lifting it will introduce a bit of gray into the photo, which I think softens the contrast a bit. And then because I manipulated this point curve, I have this refined saturation slider, which allows me to pull back some of the color saturation that was introduced to the photo. And I usually just go halfway through. Now let's see if there is any sort of a color cast with the filter that I used. This was a Maven linear polarizer filter. So I'm going to click on this dropper here, click on a gray area, and you can see that it is virtually identical, which kind of speaks to how well crafted those filters are. It didn't introduce any color contrast that I could tell. And finally, in terms of boosting color, I'm going to go over here to color calibration, which again, if you're using Lightroom, this is hidden by default. To access it, you'll click on this tri-dot on the right toolbar here, and then you're going to select Show Color Calibration. If you're using Lightroom Classic, you'll see this at the bottom of the Develop module. And so what I'm going to do is take my blue primary saturation slider, increase this a bit, somewhere right around here. Same thing with the green primary saturation. And you see what I'm doing is I'm kind of jiggling the slider, looking at what the effect is, and then kind of stopping where I am happy. So right there. You probably may not see this with the compression, but just does such a beautiful job of giving the right kind of color boost to the photo. All right, so that's what I would do for just the global edits. Like I said, I really only touched the light and the color sliders to dial those tone and color edits in on the photo. Now I want to make more refined localized edits, and that's why the masking panel, it's like my favorite part of Lightroom. It's so powerful, especially when you really get a hang of how to manipulate them together. So here, let's just hit the backslash key. You can see this is what we started with, including the distractions. And so far we've got just a nice overall looking image. We've got a good baseline for the photo. So I'm going to click on masking here. And I mentioned how I'm going to use the landscape mask, which will automatically detect attributes within the photo and suggest these different masks for you. So you can see natural ground, water. I definitely want water. Vegetation. This is good. Vegetation basically puts everything into one mask. So I'm going to select that. Mountains. Not sure what I found there. It's not always perfect, but that's okay because these are the two masks that I really want. And then I also want to make sure that I have this checkbox selected to add them to their own masks as opposed to combining them. Let's go ahead and click on create. We now have our two masks, which are already labeled, which is great. So let's start with vegetation here. The first thing I'm going to do is go down. I'm going to add some texture so you can zoom in over here. Let's actually pull back out. So let's pan here. I'm looking over here. I'm going to increase texture right around there. And then I want to see the entire image when I add clarity. So just a tiny bit there. Now, I also want to just drop the saturation of the greens. So I can do one of two things. I can either go ahead and just go to saturation and drop that overall for the entire mask, but I'd rather create a separate mask here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new mask, and then I'm going to select color range. And I specifically want to kind of address this range here. So let's turn the overlay on. You can see it already does a really nice job of selecting that color within the range throughout the entire image. I have this refine slider. If I drag it to the right, it'll add more of that color within the range. But actually what I want to do is drag it to the left. So just a little bit more restrictive. So right around here. And then what I can do is take my saturation slider and back off just a bit. So you can see here it gets really desaturated. I just want to kind of pull back a little bit. So right around there. Because you can see if I toggle this, I don't know, to me, this just looks very, very, very punchy with that color. Let's go ahead, rename this by clicking on the try dot, selecting rename, and we'll call this green saturation adjust. All right, so I already took care of vegetation in terms of the texture and clarity. And then let's go to water. So with water, I mentioned how I want to adjust the highlights specifically for the water. So I'm going to take this here and I'm going to drag it down. You can see how it's really only affecting the water, which is exactly what I want. So right around here looks good. The other thing I'm going to do is add some dehaze to the water, which adds this really kind of nice contrast to the water. And then the water itself just looks a bit warm. So very, very little touches of temperature towards the left will kind of almost neutralize that. You can see. I feel like it does a really nice job of creating a nice color harmony for the whole photo. And so if we go to the top here, you can see these are the effects of all the masks. So this is with no mask applied. And then just, again, really subtle but very effective targeted changes to the photo. And now I can finish things up by going back to the edit stack over here. I can go ahead here and add some sharpening. So let's go ahead to sharpening here and pretty much do this the same way all the time. Radius to 0.5, detail to 100. Let's zoom in at 100%. Looking over here, press and hold the Option key while dragging the amount slider to ensure that we get the right amount of sharpening. And then let's zoom back to fit. Same thing, pressing and holding an Option or Alt while dragging on the masking slider to remove sharpening from the areas where we don't need it. And here we can stop at this point by hitting the backslash key. You can see this is what we started with, and this is what we were able to accomplish with that kind of 1, 2, 3 punch. And so here's where I kind of look at the photo and I say, all right, I can stop here. I'm happy. This photo looks great. Or is there something more creative that I can do? Is there more fun that I can have with this photo? And there actually is. There are 2 other things that we can do here. So the first thing I can do is apply lens blur. So lens blur is admittedly something I don't use very often, but let's say I want to kind of really bring the focus over here to the foreground. So I'm going to go ahead and turn lens blur on. And usually the way that I use lens blur is I take the blur amount and I bring it like all the way up because it makes it a lot easier to see where lens blur is being applied. And then the next thing I do is work on the focus range. So what this is showing me is this is the closest part of the photo. This is the farthest part of the photo, basically going from here to here. And this bracketed area basically is where lens blur is not being applied. So what I want to say is don't apply lens blur from the front of the image, and then watch. I'm going to start dragging this right bumper, and I'm going to look at the photo, and I'm going to see lens blur start to be removed as we move through the frame. So watch, I'm going to start dragging this to the right, and you can see how we're starting to restore parts of the image. And so I would say right around here looks good. Like this is a good depth here. Now, of course, remember, we have the blur amount at 100, way too strong. I'm actually going to drop this down. I usually start around 20, and then I'm going to slowly build it up. And then sometimes I'm also going to work on this range here where I'm actually going to introduce more of that blur into the photo. So you can see I'm bringing this back towards the foreground of the image. So something like this looks good. I'm also going to pull back on that blur amount. And then the last thing that there is to do is to refine blur using this refinement brush. So you can see I can actually paint focus or blur in the photo. I'm going to paint focus in. I'm going to increase the flow here to 100. And basically what this will do is it'll paint full focus in wherever I draw. So I know this area here, I want it to be in focus. And so I'm just going to paint over here. And you can see how we're starting to restore that focus. I want all of this because this is all kind of in my plane of focus here. I'm going to just kind of paint like this. I also want this rock to be in focus, all of this area here. And it might be easier to just make a really large brush to paint this area, just to make less work for yourself. The next thing I'm going to do is drop flow so that it's not a full strength brush. Reduce the brush size, and then I'm going to kind of feather in focus. I'm going to start restoring some of that focus in layers. So like this, and it doesn't have to be too precise. That's one of the main reasons why it's important not to have a strong blur amount, because if it's really strong, then it'll become obvious. In fact, I'm going to pull this back right around here. Let's go ahead and paint some focus here, especially along edges. That's also very important. The edges is what will give away the effect. And so another thing I highly recommend when you're working with lens blur is to use the mute icon. So I'm going to click to see the lens blur turned off, then turn it back on. And this looks good. In fact, I'm going to dial this back even more, maybe to around 15, just to make it subtle. It doesn't have to hit the viewer over the head. Now you can see that because I applied lens blur out of order with our AI edit order of operations, this icon turns yellow. And so all I need to do is click on update all, which will put the image into a validated state. And so now we're good. The last thing I'm going to do, again, just to have some fun, is I'm going to zoom way out, like 12%. Let's go to masking, create a new mask. I'm going to select a radial gradient. The reason why I'm doing this is, I'll show you in a second, but you can see that the tops of these tree branches here, you can see that light is hitting it, and I want to accentuate that glow. So I'm going to create this gigantic radial gradient. I'm going to make it so that it kind of shines and spills onto the image at this angle. Of course, we can refine this at any time, but let's click on fit. And now to add that glow, I'm going to take dehaze, drag it all the way to -100. You can see here. And then I'm going to go to temperature, and I'm going to move it all the way to +100 to simulate kind of a warm sun glow. Now let's zoom back out again. And I'm going to reposition this kind of like this over here, even a little bit further down. Then let's go back to fit. And here's the last thing, because this might be too strong for you. Again, this is one of the benefits of working with masks, is that there is this amount slider. It's the same basic principle as what I showed you with the adaptive color, where it's kind of like an opacity or strength slider. So I can take this to 0, which effectively turns off the layer, and I'm going to slowly build in that glow. So something like this looks really good. Let's go ahead and rename this to sun glow. Let's just see that. Yeah, very subtle. In fact, I'm going to make it a little bit stronger. And there we go. So again, if we hit the backslash key, that's what we started with. And again, this is the general workflow, the order in which I apply things, the actual tools that I use for my landscape photos. And I'm actually really happy with the way this image turned out. Okay, so I hope that you kind of picked up on what I was trying to get across here, where yes, Lightroom has a bunch of tools. No, you don't have to use every single tool differently across your photos. Rather, for me, what my goal is, when someone looks at my body of work, let's say they go to Instagram and they see my photos, they see consistency through intent. And that comes through kind of, yes, you should know how these tools work. You should know which tools are in Lightroom, but that doesn't mean that you have to constantly like redefine how you edit your photos from photo to photo. That's just not sustainable. Figure out what works for you, what kind of looks good to you, and really become a master of that. And that, you will see, will bring intent. So with that, if you want to learn everything there is to know about Lightroom desktop, mobile, and web, I've got a course called Lightroom Everywhere, which I will link to in the description below. I also have this video here that I mentioned that kind of talks through some of the tools that I do often overlook. I think you'll find it helpful, or you can see what YouTube thinks you might like over here. Of course, a thumbs up is greatly appreciated, as is clicking on the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.